the economic renewal in the ancient Near East. We had some back there. I think they may be sold out, but we can take orders for any of you who want them. Distinguished Professor of Economics, University of Missouri, Kansas City, financial advisor to foreign governments. And Michael is the first person to publicly figure out how imperialism was being, the mechanism for imperialism through the balance of payments deficit. That was that was the actual tool that was being used, in addition to, of course, to military activities from time to time. He's going to outline and discuss the requirements for establishing a sound, particularly a moral international payment system, starting with national monetary and other reforms, and then proceeding to the international level. Please welcome Dr. Michael Hudson.
When I think of where Steve and I were just a few years ago, I think he's done an amazing job of bringing together in a single room so many of what must be the world's leading monetary cranks. And when I say cranks, I use it in the sense of George Bernard Shaw. Cranks turn wheels and wheels make revolutions. And that's really what we're trying to do here. And each of us seem to have come in our own way to be able to pierce a kind of mythology, a kind of cognitive dissonance that blocks people from understanding the debt problem and the money problem. Steve's book concentrates more on the history of money. I talk about the other side of the balance sheet, the history of debt, because the credit superstructure based on money is largely debt. And a lot of you have talked about how debts tend to grow more rapidly than the means to pay. Everybody wants to get rid of the debts. The problem is that debts on the one side of the balance sheet equal people's savings on the other side of the balance sheet, and nobody wants to cancel their savings. I think probably the best lead-in to explain my way of solving the problem is to tell you how I came to my own ideas. And a lot of it began in this very building. 50 years ago, I was a graduate music student at Roosevelt University upstairs. They had the best music department in the country. Roosevelt didn't know what to do with them, and so they went to the University of Indiana at Bloomington and became the Bloomington Music Department. These were mostly all of the leading German and Austrian music theorists who had to flee in the 1930s. They were my teachers. Then about 48 years ago, in 1959, upstairs, I was on the podium leading the International when Max Shachtman's Independent Socialist League merged with the Socialist Party. I didn't realize that that was about to become part of the neocon movement, and then a few years later, Max was going to become a supporter of the Vietnam War. But at any rate, the following year, Natalia Trotsky died, and I inherited all of Trotsky's copyrights, and decided to go to New York and start a publishing company. I'd got the copyrights to George Lukács's work and a number of other leading Marxist theoreticians. Much to my surprise, nobody would give me money to found a publishing company, so I had to go to work for a living. And I met a man who convinced me almost overnight to become an economist. I'd been told to visit him by one of my colleagues, and he described how water levels in the Midwest would drop, causing a decline in agricultural output, how every financial crisis in history from America to Europe had come in the fall because that's when the farmers needed to draw on the credit to move their grain. And the farmers had sold their crops in advance, very much like the modern derivatives trade. These were the first derivatives, and from the all the way going back, I found out for 4,000 years, this kind of deal had been done. When there was a crop failure, the whole financial system would have a convulsion, and the system that caused convulsions back then is virtually the same as causing it right now, although it's not so much from agriculture. I was told to read 3 books, basically, to learn economics in 1961. One of them was Frederick Soddy's Wealth, Virtual Wealth, and Debt, that showed how virtual wealth, what people thought was wealth, the stocks and the bonds and the mortgages and the bank loans, actually were financial claims on wealth, and that the financial claims, because of compound interest, tended always to run ahead of the means of payment. One of the other books was Henry George's Progress and Poverty. I was told to learn land reform because the basis of every economy still is not industry, it's still agriculture, and it's still the land. And the final book was Marx's, the first history of economic thought that was written, which my mentor had translated into English, Theories of Surplus Value. And I was told to read all of the bibliography in that, which I did. So my first big job on Wall Street was as an economist for the Savings Banks Trust Company in New York. That was a central bank for all of the savings banks. And my job for 3 years was to trace the deposit statistics. And most of you have seen the growth in the compound interest that was shown. It's an exponential curve going upwards. I found in tracing the savings bank's deposit that every quarter, when they would apply interest, there'd be a jump in savings. Every quarter again, a new interest payment to the accounts, another jump in savings. I found that going back to 1945, all of the growth in savings, not only in New York savings banks, but in the American economy, simply was the bulk of savings that existed that were growing at compound interest. It's as if the economy as a whole had left its money in a savings account and just let it accrue. And as these savings accrued, the savings banks recycled all of this money into mortgage credit. And that meant that as the savings grew exponentially, so did the mortgage loans grow exponentially. And yet the volume of land did not increase exponentially. That's fixed by nature. And the volume of building didn't go up so much. So the result was a constant increase in the price of real estate, mainly the price of land, that all comes from the growth of savings in the economy and new credit that's being recycled into mortgage credit. In my article in Harper's that Stephen has shown, I have 20 charts. They had a professional artist draw the charts. And in these charts, I have all of the graphs that will illustrate my talk, so I'm not going to go over that now. At any rate, what I realized was that not only was there a debt problem, but the problem was all of this growth in savings and the way in which the banking system recycled savings into an inflation of property prices and an inflation of stock and bond prices. In 1964, I went to work for Chase Manhattan Bank as their balance of payments analyst, and I was told to analyze the debt of third world countries. My main interest had always been international trade. And I was told to begin with Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. And every country that I would analyze, the idea was that I was supposed to say, how much can this country earn, and how much do they have free over and above their break-even costs of consumption, and however much they had extra, Chase and the New York banks was going to loan them money. So every bit of their growth in income was to be collateralized to the banking system. Unfortunately, when I did the studies, I found that the countries were already fully loaned up in 1965. And David Rockefeller kept telling the international department, well, Dr. Hudson says that you don't have, they can't afford to pay. So needless to say, the people in the international department, loan officers, wanted to get promoted. And you get promoted by making loans. And they were saying, who's this joker in the economic research department? So we went over to the Fed, and the Fed was very angry because they wanted Chase to lend a lot more money to Vietnam during the wartime years. And they said, but Mr. Hudson, according to your definition, England can't afford to borrow any money either. Can it? And I said, well, no, it's certainly insolvent under Harold Wilson. And they said, but it's going to be a good deal. And Why is it going to be a good deal? Because the American government is going to lend England the money to pay the interest to the banks, just like we're going to lend the money to Latin America to pay the interest, so they don't have to earn enough money to pay. We'll lend them the money to pay. Well, the lawyer, all of us from Chase, all of a sudden turned pale. And he said, Michael, we're going to have to use you you're going to have to, first of all, code all of your documents. He got terrified that somebody in Congress or somebody in the Senate was going to subpoena my records because of a little known law that you may find very interesting. And that's the law of fraudulent conveyance. Do any of you know what that law is? That's very interesting. The law stems from the Revolutionary War. In the American colonies knew how to cope with the British creditors. There were a lot of British creditors that would make loans to American farms, especially in New York State, which was almost like a feudal state. They would make loans with the knowledge they wanted the borrower, the farmer, to borrow so much money he couldn't afford to repay. The law of fraudulent conveyance meant that if a creditor makes a loan to a borrower without knowing how that borrower can repay the money, then that loan is nullified. And the lawyer from Chase said, well, you see the problem, Michael, that if any third world country or any congressman would subpoena your records and show that we knew that Latin America couldn't pay the debt, that, under the terms of our loans, if there's an argument between the bankers in Latin America, that debt is wiped off the books if we can't show that they can repay. And saying that the U.S. government is going to lend the money isn't showing how they can afford to actually earn the money to repay. So for the next 30 years, I worked for Chase off the books, so that if the Congress should get any of my reports, Chase could say, well, he's only a consultant, and we have a lot of different consultants. Who's to say that he's right and not the other people was right? At any rate, I then went, there's another aspect of this, that the Americans tried to avoid paying their debts to the English by something that has become a fatal flaw in our social system. That is that both sides, the loser as well as the winner in court, has to pay their own legal fees. That meant that if a British creditor sued an American debtor and tried to foreclose, he had to come all the way over to this country, and he had to pay the lawyer. And the American debtor would postpone, ask for another adjournment. The legal fees were so high that a lot of the British creditors simply didn't bother to collect the money from the American debtors. So this country got rich by not paying its debts, just as the rich people in almost every country have got rich by not paying their debts. And in fact, 2 years ago, I was in London, and a professor at the London School of Economics had me meet a number of bankers, and they said, we've had an intellectual breakthrough. We've found that the most money we can make is in credit cards because, and this is going to amaze you, Dr. Hudson, the poor are honest. They actually believe they have to repay their debts. And I said, none of our other customers believe that. We're dealing with guys who are all trying to stiff us. And now we find that the best market, the poorer they are, the more they want to pay their debts. They must think they're going to be millionaires. And that basically is, America got rich by not quite having that ethic way back then. Well, I then went to Arthur Anderson, their balance of payments economist, and did a study of the U.S. balance of payments, and found out that Europe and Asia had financed the entire cost of the Vietnam War by not cashing in all of the dollars they got for gold. I found that the balance of payments from 1950 through 1965 was exactly in balance on private account. The entire deficit was on military account. Actually, the government made money on foreign aid because none of the foreign aid money actually went abroad. It all stayed here. At that time, the Federal Reserve sort of denounced it in public, but some of my students at the New School of Social Research showed me the internal memorandums when they said that I was quite right. And the government stopped publishing statistics on the balance of payments effects of foreign aid and military because they said, I found out later, 30 years when I tried to update it a few years ago, they said some joker back in 1972 published a book showing that we actually made money on foreign aid. Well, that book was published by Orbis Books, which was the liberation theology arm of the Catholic Church. And I'd begun by that time to work with the Catholic Church on liberation theology, trying to get a debt cancellation for the Third World. And in fact, I'm still trying to do that. For the last 10 years, Ramsey Clark and I have offered to work with any third world country that wants to use the Fraudulent Conveyance Act not to pay its foreign debt. We don't have any takers because the third world countries, or rather the oligarchies that run the third world countries, want to repay their foreign debt. If there weren't a foreign debt, they'd have to create it, because the act of repaying the foreign debt depreciates their currency constantly. And when it depreciates their currency, what it depreciates is the price of their labor and the price of their land. And the oligarchy puts most of its money in hard currencies abroad. So the effect of foreign debt for the third world is to increase the value of property at the top of the pyramid and minimize the value of labor at the bottom of the pyramid. That essentially is how the international financial system works. For many years I was called Dr. Doom for talking about third world debt, and in 1990 Scudder Stevens hired me to start the first third world bond fund. They said, if we can convince you that the Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and these other countries are going to pay their foreign debts, then we're pretty sure that we've done due diligence. And at that time, Argentina and Brazil were paying 45% per year on dollarized debt. Mexico was paying $22 per year on foreign debt. And the fund that I started was the second ranking fund in the world in 1991, surpassed only by an Australian real estate fund. Well, meanwhile, I'd given a speech. I was the economist for the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR, gave a speech in 1980 in Mexico City on third world debt, and I explaining why it couldn't be repaid, that essentially the banks were adding the Brazil, Argentina, the other countries didn't have the money to repay the banks, and the banks said, that's okay, we'll just add the interest onto the debt every year. So it was growing at compound interest. I said this could only run a couple of more years before some country just said, well, if you actually want payment, of course, we can't do it. 2 years later came the Mexico default and the Latin American debt bomb. Well, there was a riot after my speech, and a lot of Americans were beaten up. People were trying to find me, but they got the other Americans, fortunately, many of whom were CIA fronts. And I didn't shed many tears. But I began to get very interested. I began to write a history of how society had dealt with the debt problem over the years. And it took me about a year to get back to the medieval time, Greece and Rome. And then in about 1982, I finally began to study the biblical lands in Sumer and Babylonia. And I found out that there was a massive, nobody had ever written an economic history of the Near East. And I found out that when every new ruler throughout the Near East, from about 3000 BC down to about 400 BC, when a new ruler would come to power, they would cancel the debts, the agrarian debts, and start their reign with an Economic Order Act. And so I went up to Harvard, and they put me on the faculty in archaeology, teaching Babylonian economics up there, and I thought that's not exactly what I'd expected. I couldn't fit anything about debt or economic history or even land into the economics curriculum I was teaching. So I stopped teaching economics, went up to Harvard. They backed me in putting together a group of archaeologists. They said, look, nobody's going to believe you if you just come out and say this. And in fact, I tried to publish some books on it, and the publisher said, this is all unbelievable. How can there be a debt cancellation? So we put together probably the 12 or 15 leading archaeologists in the world, dealing with each period of Sumer, Old Babylonia, Neo-Sumerian, Neo-Babylonian, Egypt, and everyone else. And I have those books in the back. The books can still be bought. Either Steve can arrange them or they can be bought from Schockenbach, which is one of the co-founders with Harvard of these. What we found is an interesting thing, that the reason that rulers could cancel the debts was the debts were owned primarily to the palaces and to the temples for rent on the land, for for operating public enterprises, everything from alehouses to workshops. The most recent study we did was Creating Economic Order, a meeting at the British Museum, and we found that the origins of money, contrary to the Austrian school, were all originated in the public sector, in the temples and the palaces. You know the myth, and Steve has discussed it in one of his papers on Menger. The myth is that private individuals wanted to borrow, to trade apples and cows and everything, and they thought, what do they really like in common? And they all decided that silver was what they wanted. Now, this has to be one of the stupidest ideas that has ever come up. Suppose that you have silver that you want to exchange for a cow or an apple. Who's going to refine the silver? And how are you going to weigh the silver? Is it a piece? How do you weigh it? Well, all of the weights and measures throughout antiquity were provided by the temples. And all of the mints, there's not a single private mint in all of antiquity. All of the money was coined by the temples. And the word money itself, as I'm sure you know, comes from the temple of Juno Moneta, Juno the Warner, in Rome, where money was coined during the Punic Wars. And Juno the Warner was called that because her geese had honked to let Rome know that it was being invaded by the Germans. The word money comes from the word warn, and that's the same root as monster, which was, a monster was supposed to be an omen, a warning that something was about to happen. What Rome was doing was reflecting a long tradition that went all the way back through Sumer and Babylonia. The temples and the palaces operated most of the workshops. They had the money. They had almost all of the practices of enterprise. The rate of interest was developed in the temples and palaces. And the reason they canceled the debts was not for humanitarian reasons, but it was explained by the Egyptians. And they said, if you insist in collecting all of the debts when there's a crop failure, or when there's a military hostility, or when the debtors can't pay, then you're going to disenfranchise the citizens, who at that time were the army. And if you disenfranchise the citizens, then nobody is going to be able to fight for you, and you're going to be defeated. And so the policy that the Babylonians called Andararum was a three-phase policy, and they had courts to implement it. We have all the court records. We have all of the acts. The policy was, number one, you free the bond servants. A number of you here have used the word debt slavery. That's really not a very good term. Slaves, by freeing the bond servants, you let the family members that had been pledged to creditors go back home. But often the borrower would pledge the slave. The slave was not freed. The slave was returned to the original debtor who had pledged the slave. So slaves were freed, not bond servants. And in the English language, as my Harper article editor pointed out, that word isn't even debt serfdom or debt bondage, it's debt peonage. And there's a long literature on debt peonage by people who had run plantations in Latin America and even the United States itself. You would lend money to a worker in exchange for getting their labor, and when they would come to say, well, I think I'm going to quit, the employer would say, well, you can't quit because you bought money at the store and we sold you this and it's mounted up at interest. You can't quit until you pay off the debt, and of course the debt never did get paid off. There are many books. Columbia Encyclopedia has a long book. If you look under debt peonage in Google, you'll find all sorts of histories of all this. Well, going all the way back to Sumer, we found that the origin of wage labor was precisely by creditors. The only way that the creditors could get somebody else to work for them in a world where everybody was self-supporting was to lend them money and have them work off the debt. That's why Hammurabi said, well, after 3 years at the interest rate of 33%, which was the agrarian interest rate, the workers paid off the interest enough to cancel the principal. The debt is canceled. We have court records showing that these actually were enforced. So the whole history of early antiquity was to alleviate the debt problem, because when the scribes who actually did the recording went to school, they were trained in economic theory. And much to my amazement, we have the textbooks they were trained in. The mathematics used in 2000 BC, 4,000 years ago, were more sophisticated than the mathematics taught in any university today, in any economics department. And the reason is, the first thing that the scribe was taught was compound interest. How long does it take a debt to double at the rate of 1/60th per month, 20% per year? The answer is it doubles in 60 months, in 5 years. How long does it take a debt to multiply 8 times? Well, you double twice at 15 years. How long does it take a debt to double 32 times? And that was 30 years. And that was the first thing they learned. The second thing they learned, they used quadratic equations. They made how long does it take for a herd of cattle to multiply? Well, they found an S-curve, pretty much, for a herd of cattle. They had all the growth curves for the various forms of output that were not as fast as the growth in compound debt. There are many books on Sumerian mathematics and Babylonian mathematics that show all of these texts. Now, when I began to organize the courses in Kansas City, there are 2 ways of teaching money and banking. One would have been the way that we had a very excellent presentation yesterday in Money and Banking, how money and banking works. What I like to do is begin in the way that the Babylonians did, and begin with the phenomenon of compound interest. Because if you begin that way, you realize that the whole system of banking and credit and debt is something that inherently cannot be sustained. And in fact, Adam Smith himself said that no public debt in history ever has been repaid, although some governments have pretended to do so. And in fact, he could have said the same thing about private debt. No volume of private debt has ever been repaid by the economy. The genius of the American economy today is to find a way of repaying the debt without people earning enough to repay it. And that means of repaying it is by asset price inflation. By, in the textbooks that people are taught, you're taught that banks lend money to companies to build the plant and equipment to generate the money to repay them. That is illegal under American law. No bank makes money, makes loans for companies to actually put in place means of production. And no creditor ever has. When James Watt started the Industrial Revolution with his steam engine, he went to a bank. They wouldn't lend him the money. He had to borrow from friends who mortgaged their property. The source of lending was property. When Henry Ford and all the American industrialists began, they couldn't get bank loans except by mortgaging their property or going outside of the banking system. If you look in the national income and product accounts for the source of capital formation, you find that almost all corporate investment comes from retained earnings, not from bank credit. So when you here are juxtaposing public credit and creation of money by the Treasury to bank credit, the point that most of you made and discovered is that the credit's created out of thin air by the banks as well as by the Treasury. My point is that that's not even the major difference. The major difference is when the Treasury or the government creates money, it creates it by spending on public infrastructure or on social welfare or on things that the democratic society decide are appropriate for government to spend money on. When the banking system creates credit, it is not to increase the means of production, it's to inflate asset prices. As the Harper's article shows, 70% of bank loans in this country are mortgage loans. That means that as the volume of savings grow, it's recycled into mortgage lending primarily. 20% is into stock and bond lending. The balance is largely on commercial lending. None of this lending finances the means of repaying the loan. The loan has to be repaid out of the money earned elsewhere by corporations and by the government. So the question is, how do we get this information to other people, to let them know that the system actually is misstructured? Well, you're dealing with cognitive dissonance here. People don't want to think that the system is somehow malstructured and is set up in a way that's guaranteed to fail and guaranteed to crash. They also don't want to think that it may not be possible to pay off the debts, because there's an ethic of people saying we want to repay the debts, and they think that because they want to, because they have good faith, the debts actually can be turned off. They can't. There's another cognitive dissonance, that people don't want to believe that credit is created as a free lunch, that it's created out of thin air. All of you seem to have come to the discovery by yourself that people think that when banks lend money, they're lending out savings. That there's something about the credit creation process that just strikes people as if they're wired up in the mind not to realize how the system actually works, because it seems to be creating something from nothing. And people don't want to accept that any more than they want to accept that there's a free lunch. And of course you have Milton Friedman, the lobby for the banking industry, saying there's no such thing as a free lunch. Well, of course, if you're getting a free lunch, you want to say there isn't any free lunch. I'm not getting it. But when somebody says there's no free lunch, you know, they're the guys who are getting it. And the reason Milton Friedman and the neocons and the Chicago School are so anti-government isn't because really they hate government. It's because they know that there is a central opposition of our time, a central economic opposition and a central political opposition. And that is the rent of land, the value of real estate is available as the natural tax base, but whatever the tax collector relinquishes is available to be paid as interest to the banks. And so the financial sector has a policy of untaxing property, tax labor, because they know that to the extent that they can replace property taxes with income taxes, sales taxes, and other taxes that fall on labor, all this rental value of property, the increase in asset prices, will be available to pledge to the banks as interest, and this is how the banks grow, by inflating asset prices. And the idea is that debts can be repaid now by inflating the prices of property, and that means deflating the economy at large, because the more money you have, all of this debt involves interest charges, and the greater the debt, the more the interest has to be paid to the financial sector. And the more interest is paid, the less income borrowers, labor, corporations, cities, states, and governments have to spend on consumer goods and on investment goods. So the fact is that as the volume of bank credit grows, the economy is more and more constricted as the economic surplus is diverted away from new investment, away from spending, away from consumption, onto just paying interest to the banks. And the bankers don't spend money on consumption or investment, although they build big buildings. They spend it on making even new loans to continue the process, and that's the phenomenon that we're seeing today. Now, earlier this year, I was appointed research director and professor at the Riga Graduate School of Law in Latvia. I went there because the Prime Minister and the City Council asked me to redesign the tax laws of the country, and the reason I was willing to do that was because it is the most backward tax law in the entire world. How could anyone turn it down? It was a post-Soviet, when they got their freedom from Russia, the IMF came in and advised them, do not tax property. There's no property tax in Latvia, no capital gains tax, no tax on financial wealth, a 65% flat tax on labor. The result is that the Latvians are emigrating, mainly to, of all places, Ireland. The IMF came in and said, what you need to do is make more Latvians emigrate, you need to bring in the Romanians, and the more Russians, they'll work at a lower rate. This is actually written up as their proposal. The birth rate is declining, suicide rates are up. It's exactly like Russia, that literally this sacrifice of the economy almost all of the factories in Latvia have been closed down, and Latvia was the software center for the Soviet Union and had a manufacturing sector. The factories have been turned into real estate projects. Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania have the largest real estate boom in the entire world because there's no tax on property, and the foreign banks are coming in and creating credit. Under the terms, when Latvia got its independence from Russia, it naturally wanted to turn to Europe. The terms of its joining Europe is that it cannot run a budget deficit, and this is a country that needs infrastructure that was totally run down under the Soviet occupation. Even the buildings are almost worn out. They have no public transportation, very few bridges. The government is prevented under the law of joining the euro from getting the money to build the bridges. The only source of revenue is to tax labor at a rate guaranteed to cause unemployment, economic collapse, and depopulation, which is the explicit aim of the IMF and the World Bank. So I thought that by going over there, redesigning the tax law, I can juxtapose the bad kind of tax with the good kind of tax. And what we're going to do is tax property. We're going to replace the tax on labor with a land tax on real estate and on the rent-yielding resources that the kleptocrats from the Soviet times, the insiders, were able to grab over there. I have the support of not only the Prime Minister, but the leading opponent in next month's elections for Latvia says that if he's elected, he'll appoint me financial advisor also. So we are putting together a whole group of like-minded people. We've integrated the Riga School of Law with the University of Missouri at Kansas City, where that university is the main counter juxtaposition to the University of Chicago and to the monetarists. We call it creditary theory. Steve knows most of the people there. My time's almost up, and I want to touch upon one other thing, since so many of you have mentioned the role of religion in things. I mentioned that the Babylonian debt cancellation word was underarum. This appears in the Bible under the word duror, which was the Jubilee law. The knowledge in the last 20 years, the knowledge of Babylonian language has led to a retranslation of the economic portions of the Bible. Most of the economic, and the Bible basically is all about economic reform, wrapped in stories to show the morality of reform. In Luke, Luke 10, when he describes Jesus' first speech, when he goes to the synagogue in Jerusalem and unrolls the scroll to Isaiah, he said, "I have come to proclaim the year of the Lord," Dror. And the year of the Lord was the debt cancellation. In fact, we now have from the Dead Sea Scrolls all sorts of midrashes, that is, collections of all of the different parts of the Old Testament where they talk about the debt cancellation and usury. And in fact, it was shortly after giving this speech that, as Stephen mentioned earlier, Jesus went to the temple and overthrew the money changers. Because at that time, the Jewish religion was taken over by someone who inverted it and made Judaism into the opposite of what it was. He's called the founder of modern Judaism, Rabbi Hillel, who was the Milton Friedman of his day, the hack for the financial interests, and it was Hillel who achieved fame by what he called the prose bull, where a debtor would say, I free the creditor and waive all my rights under sacred law, so I promise not to insist that my debt will be canceled on the Jubilee. This was what split the Jewish religion at the time of Jesus. This was what led Jesus to oppose the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And it was that split in religion that essentially underlay Christianity. Although the time at which Christianity was first moving was in the Roman Empire, and there was no way you could cancel the debts, because every popular leader in Rome who tried to cancel the debts was murdered, beginning in 133 BC with the Gracchi. And the social war was lost. We all know what happened. There was a decay into the Dark Ages there because the source of money dried up with the source of debt. And the interesting thing here is that when you look at the long picture of the history of credit, a century ago, people thought that the world began with barter and then moved into money and then achieved the credit economy of the 19th century. This is the inverse of what happened. Society began with a credit economy in Sumerian times. People had silver, but nobody wanted to go out and weigh little pieces of silver. If you went to the ale house, you're not going to give a little piece of silver and try to weigh it out, because the weighing gets harder and harder as you get small. Everybody would run up a tab, and the tab was run up against what they would get at harvest time, or what they would get at the new year when the debt settlement date was made for the palace workshops and the temple workshops. Later, about 2,000 years after the use of silver by the temples and the palaces, you had coinage in the classical antiquity, largely to pay military. And then after you had the debt problems, after Rome took over the world and stopped the debt cancellations that were still occurring, you had the world dry up into a barter economy. So the move is from a credit economy to decay into a money economy to decay into a barter economy. That seems pretty much where we're going now. I'm not sure how much more time I have. I've gone over it already? Oh yes, there's a slide to illustrate a lot of this. Okay. There are two slides. The IMF just published a book that Steve's friend Bob Meyer sent me a copy of. I'm sorry he can't be at this conference. And this is the purposes for which money is created. You have here money at the bottom, bank credit. I'll try to bank credit, and then securities at the top. You see in 1970, the debt pyramid was about 100% of GNP. Now it's gone up to about 300% of GNP. While the bankers claim that they're honest brokers, that they're the guardians of society against inflation, the banking system has achieved the most rapid inflation of any period in world history. What has been inflated is not wages, is not consumer prices, it's the price of property. And the objective has been to increase the power of property over the property of the power of labor and the power of industry, to maximize property prices relative to wages, so that it now takes longer and longer for workers to obtain housing or to obtain retirement income. Now there's another, so the bottom one is the same chart in a different way. This chart's the same thing that we had in our banking talk yesterday. You have the currency at the bottom. People are not using more currency. You have M1, you have M3. Even M3 doesn't really reflect it. The fact is that in today's world, any asset can be pledged as collateral for debt, and the limit of debt is the market value of all the assets in the world. Last week in the Wall Street Journal, the main debt promoter in the country, Michael Milken, said that there's still a mass of unlocked value in America and in foreign countries. By unlocked value, he meant that somewhere in the world there is still enough property and enough companies and enough government enterprises that have not been pledged to creditors for their income to be used as to be paid out as interest. The objective, Mr. Milken said, is for all of the economic surplus all over the world, all the value of land, all the value of industry, all the value of government power to tax to be pledged for interest. And at that point, he said, all the value will be unlocked. Now, I cannot think of a better euphemism for what actually is debt peonage as what he calls unlocking value and what Alan Greenspan calls wealth creation. When Alan Greenspan says wealth creation, all of you who have read Frederick Soddy knows he's talking about virtual wealth creation. And what he means is the increase in debt means the increase in the economic value. Now, the final point I want to make is on the savings rate. You must have seen in all of the newspapers the discussion that the American savings rate has fallen to zero. This is nonsense. The American savings rate has never been higher. It's about 20% of national income now. However, all of the savings that you're having are being generated are being lent out, and so if the increase in saving equals the increase in debt, that's counted as zero net saving because the saving in the debt balance. The problem is that all of this saving that's occurring, the 20%, is being done by the top 10% of the United States. So you have an economy that is now bifurcating between savers at the top and debtors at the bottom 90%. The bottom 90% are running into debt to savers at the top at the rate of compound interest, which, as you know, goes right off the charts. And the only way that this system can be kept going is by the banks creating enough credit to keep inflating asset prices by enough that to enable the debtor to borrow the interest on the balance, on the increase in the value, unlocking value, in order to pay the banks and literally borrow against the asset price inflation. So that's basically the economic system we're having now. When you're talking about fragility and the fact that it can't last, I think when you translate it into specific terms like this, people may begin to understand you, but it's necessary to go beyond the monetary issue itself, to place the issue in the long historical terms that I've tried to describe, and also the mythology of privatization, the view that private enterprise is more efficient across the board than anything that the government can be done. If you look at history, the most successful economies are all mixed economies. They're both the public and the private sector. They're market economies. The public economy from Sumer and Babylonia down through Greece and Europe have been in charge of basic infrastructure. The idea is, has always been until now, to supply infrastructure services at a subsidized rate in order to lower the economy's cost. The myth of this privatization is underlying Chile's disastrous privatization, Margaret Thatcher's privatizations, which have led to the Conservative Party being similarly out of power forever until the Labour Party went to the right of it, and the looting of the third world in the post-Soviet states since the 1990s. So it's necessary to put the financial issue in the context of the overall private-public balance. And I think if that can be done, then you've recast the terms of the debate. But when you show that the problem is not only the debt, but the savings, because all of these debts are somebody's savings, and when you tell the people that on balance, people think of themselves as savers because they have savings accounts, but the fact is that for the bottom 90% of the population, the debts exceed the savings, and when you recast the national income between the top 10 and the bottom 90, you're going to be able to explain people that their dream, their myth, that if you work hard enough, you can end up a millionaire, and 75% of Americans are reported by the Pew survey to believe that this is just a dream, that they're never going to end up this way if they have to pay all of their income as excess prices to housing to pay off the mortgage, is consumer debt in order to break even. When you show the unpayability of debt and the impossibility of these compound interest curves is occurring over time, you can let their brains do their own work. Thank you.
Questions?
Great presentation. Just could you go through one more time for a home that was valued maybe at $10,000 in 1970, today is $100,000, and how the banks are the root of that appreciation? Just an example. Okay,
the Harper's article has exactly those examples. It's been done in two ways. Number one, people think of the price of a house not simply as the price, but how much they can afford to pay out of their income. The standard of banks now is that housing, the mortgage payments should absorb no more than 33%, well, stretch it to 40%, well, maybe 50% of their income if the person's poor. So the question is, how do you enable people to pay a third or more of their income to the banks? You've done it in three ways. Number one, you've lowered the interest payments. Alan Greenspan, as I said, created the largest inflation in world history, but the inflation has all gone into the credit markets. 99.99% of money and credit in this country is spent on stocks, bonds, real estate, and bank loans, not on goods and services. I mentioned before as a comment from the floor that every single day, the entire national income of this country passes through the New York Clearinghouse. And now it also passes through the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. That all of this, this vast payment system has nothing to do with producing goods and services. So Greenspan has inflated the money supply so that interest rates have gone down. They've also said that instead of the 30-year mortgages, you now don't have to pay amortization. You can now have interest-only loans. Literally, your debt will be there forever under these loans. You only pay the interest. Secondly, you require lower down payments. Instead of requiring the traditional 20% down payment, you now have loans with 0 down payment. And my banker friends in Illinois tell me that their normal loan now has no down payment at all. And in fact, if I want to borrow to get a building, they will actually lend me more than I have to pay because they know I'm going to have construction charges and I'm going to have to pay the lawyer for kicking everybody out of the house so that I can make a condominium out of it. So they'll lend me the money to pay the lawyer to kick out all the tenants and make the condominium. So that's the kind of bank loan that is being negotiated today. It's easier and easier to pay, but of course, on these easier terms, all of your income has to be pledged to the bank. There's nothing more available for spending. And in fact, that's why the Fed now is expecting a downturn next year because people's income is going for debt service, not for goods and services, not to buy the goods that they produce, and there's going to be a shrinking of the market. So
does that increase the price of the property?
Well, because suppose there's 100,000 houses, $10,000 that you mentioned, and you're paying 10% a year, which was the case even higher back in 1980. Well, then you have to pay $10,000 a year in interest. But if the interest rate goes down to 5%, then you can pay the same amount of money. Then you can afford to pay your $10,000 a year out of your $1,000 a year out of your income. That same amount of money can support twice as large a loan. The lower the interest rate, the larger the loan can be supported. It's a simple trade-off. And again, the charts are in the Harper's article that Steve was supposed to get. And the less amortization, the more interest you can pay, and the higher the collateral value. So it's all based on the amount of debt that your income will support.
Thank you, Professor Hudson. It's a very interesting presentation. I had just 2 things. One, could you please tell us again what is the title of your book where all these archaeological findings are?
There are 4 books that were in the past. By the way, not everybody has paid me for. I see the books have disappeared, but I don't have a proportional increase in money. Somebody has not paid yet, and if they could pay, I would appreciate it. There are 2 books: Debt and Economic Renewal in the Ancient.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the titles.
The title is Debt and Economic Renewal in the Ancient Near East and Creating Economic Order. All these books are, the earlier 2 were published by Harvard, the last 2 by CDL Press. You can buy all of the books from CDL Press.
And you are the editor of all?
I'm the co-editor of the volumes, and this is the Harvard, the group of archaeologists that I put together.
That's great. And then one last thing, it's just a minor point. You said, you mentioned Juno Moneta and all these very interesting things, and you mentioned how the money came to be minted in the temples, and this is why the coins always bore the effigy of gods. But that is not the public sector. That is the spiritual sector. It's the arts and sciences, and it's not the same.
Originally, what people called religion was actually the economic core of society. And anthropologists find that in almost all tribal societies, it's considered impolite to make a gain. And the reason is that they're very low surplus societies. And in a low surplus society, one person's gain is another loss. And so that's considered antisocial to make a gain. The only way in which this could be legitimated was by doing it for God, by doing it in the temples themselves. And so the temples ended up as the mediators of society's economic surplus, just as the chief's household is the mediator in tribal societies. And one of the roles of religion in early society was to mediate the economic surplus, and most of the businessmen, the traders, all had official positions in the temples. It's all gone over in the books. The earlier title, by the way, that goes into this more is Urbanization and Land Use in the Ancient Near East. And the first volume was privatization in the Near East of classical antiquity, where we also talk about the privatization, the land grab in Rome, and how the origins of private property and land wasn't in one person selling his land to another, because land was inalienable in all early societies. The only way in which you could transfer land was to relinquish it to a foreclosing creditor. And even this was so difficult that in Babylonia and surrounding areas such as Nuzi, debtors would adopt the creditor as their son. And because they adopted the creditor, the lender, as their son, when they died, the son, the creditor, would inherit the land. So a Babylonian proverb was, a creditor has many relatives, because the creditors ended up related to everybody and would inherit the land. That was the only way you could get around the archaic and traditional barriers against transferring land. And Plutarch describes how much the same thing happened in Sparta in the 7th century, and Toynbee has gone to discuss this for classical antiquity. You can, on my website, by the way, you can find most of this, and next week I'm putting on much of the biblical material on the website, michael-hudson.com.
I question you on the statement here, just a comment. Asset inflation, is it a form of fictional bookkeeping?
In the 19th century, Henry George and Marx both called it fictitious capital, because it was what was called watered cost. So it's fictitious in the sense that it's not real, it's inflated. But if people believe it, it's not a fiction, you can say. So if enough people believe that the land is really going up in value, if they believe that this is wealth, the wealth of nations, then to them it's wealth, but it's really the debt of nations. And if someone can explain that wealth is debt, you'll get people to do that kind of mental judo to understand how it works.
So if you increase the value of property or land...
Let's say you inflate it. The word is inflate. And not value. Under classical economics, value can all be reduced to what is paid as labor. Interest does not involve labor. So interest is a rentier income. There are two forms of income. Value, which is ultimately produced by labor, including the labor that goes into making the capital goods that produce things, and rentier income, which is a claim imposed from outside the production system by the financial overhead. And this is what people have great difficulty in understanding. They think that everybody who earns an income is equally productive. The essence of classical economics and the entire line of economic philosophy from the Enlightenment is that only labor produces value. The ideal of classical economics was to get rid of land rent, to use it as the basis of taxation, and to replace the interest charges by the banking system by essentially treating loans as equity loans. This was what the Saint-Simonians had tried to do in France from the 1820s on. By the 1860s, the Saint-Simonians had founded the Société Générale. Essentially, their idea of banks is banks would be a mutual fund, making loans to industry and taking their share of their return in the form of stock. Very much like the discussion of Islamic banking that we had earlier. It was discovered independently by the Europeans. Marx was a Saint-Simonian, and throughout the 19th century, this was the idea that the public treasury was going to create the money, and the banking system, instead of earning interest, would earn equity, would earn dividends. All of that has been stripped out of the history of economic thought, and you will not get that in any textbook on money and banking today, but it was 90% of what was taught in the 19th century.
Okay, do you have a prediction of what you think will happen when asset prices do collapse in this country and maybe Japan or Europe, if they will collapse at all?
Well,
what's going to happen?
The point at which they collapse is when the current income will not cover the carrying charges. And that's already happened in the property market now, and I've gone into a lot of this again in the Harper's article. What happened, inflation has been defined as a transfer of income from creditors to debtors. But deflation, a decline in asset prices, is a transfer of property from debtors to creditors. So when the collapse comes, there's going to be an immense foreclosure process and a transfer of property. You've already seen that since 1980 in the third world, where governments cannot pay their foreign debt and have been directed by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to start paying the banks and paying their bondholders by selling off the public domain, which of course deprives them of the user fees of the public domain and makes their economies utterly uncompetitive. So there's going to be a huge foreclosure by the creditor interests. The usual things that follow is a decline in the birth rate, decline in longevity, rise in suicide payments, increase in poverty, and political centralization under national emergency by the creditors. When Hayek wrote wrote The Serfdom, he described the government and government planning and government spending on welfare, government infrastructure spending. Anything the government did was supposed to lead to serfdom. What he didn't say was that every economy is planned. And to the extent that the government is not the planner, the planning function shifts into the bankers and the creditor interests. That also was part of the 19th century expectation, that the bankers would become the mediators of industrialization. But we now know that contrary to the 19th century optimism, that not only were the classical economists wrong, but Marx was utterly wrong in thinking, wouldn't it be wonderful when the bankers take over and we have a rational system? He didn't realize that the bankers were not going to lend for industrial growth, that they were going to lend for asset price inflation. So the government is now out of the business, especially now that you've made central banks in every country, like the Federal Reserve here, politically independent. That means that the banking and financial system is outside the control of the political system, and that the central planner, we're now more centrally planned today than fascism was and that the Soviet Union was, but the central planner is the banking system.